Welcome to Engaging Culture, a podcast presented by Bridgeway Christian Church. I'm Brian Kiley. On this episode, Pastor Lance Hahn and I are joined by Bridgeway's Care and Compassion Manager, David Heitzler, for a conversation about mental health. Mental health challenges are very common in our society, and we want to look at how our faith equips us to face our own mental health challenges and serve those who are struggling in our community. All of that and more on this episode of Engaging Culture. Well, hello, welcome to Engaging Culture. I'm Brian Kiley, and I'm having trouble with my TH sounds today, but that's all right.
I feel like you had extra coffee today.
I kind of feel that way. Okay, here's the thing.
Yeah.
I am not a morning person at all.
Okay.
But I'm learning to become one.
Aww.
I went to bed at 8:45 last night and got up at 4:30.
How old are you?
You are a champion.
I have turned into an old man.
Wow.
Overnight. Me from 2 weeks ago would be so ashamed of what I've become. So we're just going to say that's why I'm all messed up this morning.
Okay.
We're still in the morning, right? Anyway, joined by Lance Hahn.
I'm Pastor Lance Hahn. How are you?
Hey, and
Hi,
we have the one and only David Heitzler, whose nickname is Sonny.
Okay, I'm going to really struggle with that.
No way we get through the episode without dropping that.
Calling him Sonny. I don't know who David is.
Me neither.
That's very strange.
It's very confusing. I'm glad we've
is.
confused everyone.
Everyone.
We have David, quotation marks, Sonny Heitzler.
Sonny's
I'm
been with
excited
me
that you're
my
here.
whole life. It depends on how clinical you want me to be. If
Yeah.
you're going to call me David or Sonny, so it's up to you.
I think it's
Yeah.
more of a Sonny type conversation.
All right, sounds good.
And it's important that our audience knows that Sonny is a fellow Sacramento Kings fan. So,
Praise the Lord.
yeah, he was my date to opening night at Golden One Center.
Oh, that's
It was pretty
very
fun.
cool.
We had a good time.
We had the best time.
Even though the Kings lost, but that's all right.
By the way, what is the record as it stands right now?
6-4, which
6
is
and
much better
4.
than I was expecting.
Boom.
I think you and the rest of the entire world.
The rest
Including
of
the Kings
humanity.
organization?
The Kings themselves are shocked. How did this happen? But
Yes.
it's still early. Plenty of time to,
Screw that up.
for the ship to sink. But
Yes.
we're happy with how it's going so far.
Excited for all of it.
Sonny, very excited to have you with us today. We're talking mental health. Obviously, you work in our Care and Compassion department. You are in an MFT program.
Yeah,
I should say that much more confidently.
I finished the MFT program, which is nice.
Hey, there we go.
I
All right.
accomplished something.
And now
That's
you're
right. You're in your hours. That's what
Yeah.
you're doing right
Yeah,
now.
yeah.
Yeah. I swear I'm not a terrible friend. So you're in that world. Tell us a little bit about kind of your background and your interest in the mental health field.
Yeah, I grew up in a Christian family, and I didn't know what I wanted to do as a kid, like most kids feel. And I actually was going through junior college and stuff thinking I wanted to do engineering. I loved like problem solving. I loved thinking about finding the solution to things. And I got to math, and I realized that I don't care that much about problems. I care more about people. There was always these two parts to me. There was analytical and this part that was sensitive, and I needed a reason to analyze things or to actually engage with and feel like I'm caring about people's lives. So that took me towards psychology. It took me towards something that combines those things a little bit. But that's what I went through Jessup and Western Seminary and finished with a degree in therapy, and I'm here now.
But you're here now.
I've been at Bridgeway for 7 years.
Man,
Wow.
really?
Yeah,
It's a long
That's
time.
awesome.
It is. It's crazy.
I would think that you were more like Jesus by now.
Yeah.
Totally kidding.
So what went
People's
wrong?
first response.
Yeah, no, I'm totally kidding. You are a great representation of Christ. I love the fact that you are so visible as a leader in our Care and Compassion department. So for those of you that do attend Bridgeway, usually you can find Sonny out in our lobby. He runs the table for Care and Compassion, and he is very present, I would say. So it's super neat to have you as a leader of that because you have such a beautiful spirit towards health and healing. So anyway, I'm a big fan of yours. You know that, though.
Thanks, Lance. I appreciate that.
Amen. Ditto. Now, David, you shared something during our prep for this episode that I thought was pretty interesting. You have a definition of mental health that you like. Can you share that definition with us and then maybe talk a little bit about it?
Yeah. What is mental health is such a hard question. It feels so elusive, and it's just like some people don't have a scope for even talking about mental health. Like it feels like that's just something that doctors think about or shrinks think about. And I think the best definition I've heard going through years of school and asking myself questions like this is from a psychiatrist named Daniel Siegel, and he's a secular psychiatrist. He has a lot of good stuff. If you've ever heard of him or want to look into him, but his definition is that mental health basically boils down to the concept of integration. And by that, he means that we integrate every part of our lives and our history and our experiences together. And if there's something going wrong, there's something that our emotions or our thoughts or our relationships are kind of distorted, it's usually because there's something we're avoiding. There's something that we're not wanting to face or we're trying to compensate for. And that's and it's simple, but it's so profound in the sense of how it brings some articulation to what that even looks like. So there's a lot to that, and I think the Bible even speaks to it. But
yeah, I mean, integration itself is not a especially deep idea, but it's one of those ideas that kind of, to reiterate what you said, it's a simple concept with vast and wide-ranging implications. The idea of the different kind of elements of our lives are integrated, we're going to be healthy. But if we're avoiding different things, suppressing different things, obviously, I mean, you see a lot of that in the work that you do. That's where we start to run into challenges, right?
Yeah.
Now, Lance, getting to you, you have written some books about the brain and how the brain works, and you've written one in particular. Your first book, How to Live in Fear, was all about anxiety and panic disorder. So we've got Sonny, the kind of on the clinical side here. You've got you on the pastoral side. Obviously, mental health is very personal to you. Why is that?
Yeah, and that's because it is literally personal to me. I grew up with mental health issues, which is panic disorder. So I have not only generalized anxiety disorder, but a panic disorder is a very narrow portion of that. Where there was a time as a child when I was actually to the place of agoraphobia. And so I've wrestled with it my entire life. I take medicine.
Real quick, for those who don't know, what is agoraphobia?
Agoraphobia is the inability to be in outside spaces. A lot of times it's linked to a social disorder to where you can't be around people. So the idea that you would go out into an open space and there would be people there, that is terrifying. So you stay in a safe environment, which is usually your home. So people that are extraordinarily agoraphobic never leave their home. They're actually shut-ins. But the idea of suffering through irrational thought processes and not being able to just control and think whatever I want to think or live however I want to live, that reality has been mine since my earliest memory. So anyway, yeah, it's very, very personal. So I'm going to come at it from a practical standpoint. I'm going to come at it from a spiritual standpoint, right? In this discussion, I am not trained in the same way that Sonny is, right? So he's going to have some expertise that I'm not going to have.
Yeah. And even through your writing and through the ways that you've talked about your own experience with anxiety and panic disorder, that, of course, has rustled up all sorts of other people to come to you and to talk about their different mental health challenges. So that, I would imagine, that's given you, and this isn't something you and I have really talked about, but it's given you kind of a unique perspective in that I think people see you as a safe person maybe to talk to because of your own experience.
Yeah, in an extraordinary way. It's so much so that because once you bridge into that conversation, right? And you start talking about, hey, we're all broken and we're real people and we all have issues. All of a sudden, everyone starts talking about who they really are. Yeah. And it feels like, it's not true, but it feels like everyone has mental health issues. Like, especially, and technically they do, which we're going to talk about in a moment. But in the extreme side, even Bridgeway, knowing that it's a safe place where the pastor is going to jump out ahead of everybody else, they're willing to come here because it is a safe location. So we do have an extraordinary amount of people that struggle with things like depression and anxiety and schizophrenia and challenges in that mental health field.
Yeah. Praise the Lord.
Yeah. And
not just to speak to that, I honestly, it's funny because people will, it's one of those things where people don't know how to treat it exactly. And they're
right.
Like the question is, oh, well, you work in soul care. Are you guys busy? Like,
so like, what do you do?
How's business? Like,
yes.
and that's so, over the years, it's been so funny to me to wrestle with that. But it's really settled in to where, along the lines of what you're talking about, Lance, everybody has issues.
Yeah.
Everybody has something that where if there's a safe place for us to take those things and to actually be seen and to actually feel like that it can be held in a constructive way, as busy as we can be in the mental health or the counseling world, the more good is coming from that. The more prepared we are to engage with God without our flesh, ourselves getting in the way. So it is such a positive thing, and it's become like, yes, we are busy, and praise God, like that they're able to.
Well, it's out there. You're either going to deal with it or you're not. I mean,
exactly.
The idea that people go, "Oh, are you in counseling?" Like as if that's a negative, and you go, "Oh, you're jacked. You're just not in counseling." You know what I mean? Like,
I'm being honest about my issues.
Yeah. So you're not only messed up, but you're also in denial. So praise the Lord.
Right. So along those lines, you guys have both kind of touched on this a second ago. It seems like certainly in a lot of Christian circles, but not even exclusively in Christian circles, in secular circles as well, there is still kind of a stigma around mental health, and there's talk about the need to remove the stigma. So I want to take this question in two parts. First of all, why does that stigma exist? Sonny, let's start with you, and kind of seeing it from the clinical perspective. Why do you think that exists?
So many reasons.
For the next 3 hours.
Pick your favorite 12.
Okay. Oh, man. I guess I'll talk a little bit about from the mental health historical side of things that I can speak to is just, I think that there has been friction between the idea of psychology and the idea of religion or faith in America's history, Western history, since the dawn of psychology. And that's because a lot of the fathers of psychology in Western medicine were atheists. They were humanists. And in response to that was was a lot of fundamentalism and a lot of very rigid responses in church history. Yeah. And it created this kind of adversarial at odds dynamic from the roots of both of these things, the roots of religion in America and the roots of the concept of medical psychology in America. And from that, obviously, as you can see in the world, there are thousands of different variations of each of those things that have developed into our modern world, as far as the psychology world and the mental health world and the religious and church culture. So I think that a big part of the stigma is really that there is that religious stigma in the church culture that if you believe in psychology, you're trying to save yourself rather than asking God to save you. And there's a lot I could speak to that as far as like, I know Lance does too, as far as that's not the case. But also I think there's another element of it where we're a very individualistic culture. And that has influenced both of those worlds where just regular cultural response, someone on the street is going to ask, oh, you need somebody to talk through your problems with? You need somebody to help you? Like, why aren't you just pulling yourself up by the bootstraps and getting it done? So, and both of those reactions that I think are based in fear and shame really do contribute to the stigma that happens.
Yeah, that's good. What do you think, Lance?
Yeah, I mean, first of all, the idea of weakness is shamed anywhere. Yeah. So, but think about it this way: the term mental health issues. Okay, so I recently was filling out an application for something. I will not mention what that is, but on there it said, "Have you ever been treated for mental illness?" I checked no, which is odd because I take medication and have been treated for mental. And the reason why I checked no was because it's not what they were really asking. What they were asking was about what they think mental health issues are. And you go, well, no, not that, but yes, this. It's technically mental health, but not the way you're thinking of it. Right. So even trying to answer the question is super weird. And I felt a little guilty about it because I was like, I'm not trying to avoid the conversation. I'm trying to avoid your stigma. I'm trying to avoid your assumptions. So think about it this way. Where in society is the phrase mental used in a positive way? So, for example, you have mental institution, mentally ill, mentally retarded, mentally deranged, even all the way to Wayne's World. Dude, you're mental, right? Actually, that was Bill and Ted. But the idea that when you say somebody is mental, it means that you are messed up to a degree where something is so wrong with you that you are a weakling or you are somehow heavily distorted. So for the stigma of the idea that I think what Sonny was talking about was this idea of things are out of control. It's you need help. You're weak. You're dangerous. You are unhinged. You know what I'm saying?
Yeah.
All that negative stereotype is all over it. In a Christian context, it's if you were a better Christian, you wouldn't be struggling with this.
Right.
That's the bottom line. And that's something that I've been trying to defeat since day one.
Right. Yeah, I think that's important. I think I completely agree with what you guys have both shared. Two other things that I think are a part of this discussion as well is number one, for the most part, mental health issues are invisible. Sometimes somebody who is really struggling, there might be, or you're in a conversation with somebody and you might realize, okay, there's kind of maybe something going on here, but for the most part, it's invisible. And invisible problems, I think we tend to underestimate.
Yeah, you downplay them.
Exactly, how real and how serious they are. And you could say this about so many other things, but I think the second issue is also just ignorance. It's for those who have never struggled, for those who have not had any sort of mental health challenge, they don't really have a category for what it is, so it's hard to empathize or appreciate it. I mean, I can even speak for myself. I don't know that, if you had asked me before the age of 25, someone's, depressed or they're struggling with depression, like, I would just sort of be like, okay, like, stop doing that,
Yep.
Like, be happy. Like, there's lots of other stuff. But I can, remember it like it was yesterday. The first time that I just, in the middle of a normal day on campus at seminary, just wanted nothing more than just to crawl in a hole and never be seen by anybody. And I'm like, okay. Like, and I've had different moments throughout my life where I'm like, okay, this is really irrational, but I don't feel good right now.
Yes.
So just even that little personal experience was enlightening to me to be like, okay, this is a different deal than I understood.
Yeah. And in response a little bit to both of those, I think that a big part of what you were talking, just the concept of mental, is so rooted in symptom management in our culture that it's associated with, okay, if there's anything mental that you're referencing, it means you're out of control, you're off the charts, ill. There's something that is uncorrectable about you, and that's so far from the truth. And I think that, like your experience, Brian, I think a lot of people listening can honestly resonate with, like if we've lived 25, 30 years in this life, we probably know what it's like to feel something that is also irrational. To feel that it's deep. The experience is so much deeper, and we know it when we feel it. Like, oh, this is what anxiety is.
Yeah.
This is what depression is.
And I can't talk myself out of it.
Yeah.
Well, I think that right there is the key. That idea of irrationality, that it was not attached to something you can control.
Yep.
So some people have a panic attack and they're in a very peaceful environment and they don't understand why, because everyone from the outside is trying to look for the connectors, and they're going to go, "Oh, are you nervous about?" No. Oh, well, then you're scared of... No.
Yeah.
It's coming in, and it's a chemical. We'll get into this a little bit later, but for me, it's a chemical issue to where irrationality, it's coming from the most unusual places. I think one of the things that is very challenging for people that struggle with issues is somebody says it's all in your head. When people say it's all in your head, they mean you should think differently, and as if that's going to solve it. But that's not how it works. If it was logical and rational, you could think your way out of it. But it's not logical and rational. A lot of it's chemical. So, for example, I could inject a chemical into your body and make you feel nervous. I can inject a chemical into your body. It doesn't matter what you're thinking about.
Yeah.
It's actually a physiological response. I can make you feel fight or flight when there's nothing even endangering you.
Yeah.
So just knowing chemicals are spinning. Here's the other thing that I want to highlight about what you were saying about it being invisible. If you have a physical damage, if you have a physical problem, if you have a physical disability, you get preferred parking. If you have a mental one, you need to suck it up. You understand what I'm saying? So if I roll up in a wheelchair, people will get out of my way and we will adjust and do ADA regulations. Right? American Disabilities Act. The idea, but if I have it in my head, nobody can see it. You don't get a placard. You don't get anything else. And they say, you should just be normal because I can't see your problem.
I think that's a huge point, is that our culture is much more comfortable dealing with the external. We know what to do when we see it and we watch it. but we don't. But we don't.
It's why
know
they
what
don't
to
like
do.
spirituality either.
No one would ever come up to a person with a broken leg and say, "Come on, man, it's all in your leg."
Yeah, it's all in your leg.
Yeah,
Suck it up.
Yeah.
it is, and that's a
you-
problem. Like on some level, you're right, but on it's that's not to say it's within our power to just immediately fix it, right?
Yeah, one thing I do want to clarify before we get into this a little bit further is the practical titles that are given to mental health issues, and you got to help me a little bit with this, Sonny, but we're talking about things like anxiety, depression, PTSD. We're talking about issues of schizophrenia, bipolar, associative disorders. I mean, that when we're talking about mental health issues, it's anything that ultimately affects the way that you process things, right?
Yeah.
And so, but to make it more tangible, because people don't quite understand, like when you gave that, I think it was a beautiful, holistic definition, but I think people are still trying to figure out, so when you say mental issues, what are you trying to say? So for me, it was panic disorder. Pastor Brian just highlighted a depression issue, right? But what are some more of the practical names that we give to mental health
But you
issues?
covered most of them.
Okay. Hey, right on.
So
No,
hey,
there's,
all right,
there's
there we
a
go.
whole there is a whole range. It's a whole spectrum of severity too.
Right.
And I think that when you get into something like panic disorder, for example,
Yeah.
what you're wrestling with, Lance, I think you articulate so well in material and things that you teach on is that it enters into past a threshold where the chemical response in your brain is so conditioned
Yes.
to respond a certain way that it doesn't even matter what the external factors are sometimes,
Right.
or if there's any justification or any way you can even start thinking different or start living different.
Right.
There's might be some little thing that triggers in your brain and it ends up spiraling.
Yes.
And that's an example of a diagnosable disorder, of panic disorder.
Yes.
Where you might take medication for a season to compensate. You might need maybe more support in certain areas of life than other areas. So that there is a spectrum to something like a diagnosable disorder, like major depressive disorder.
Yes.
If you have major depressive disorder, they've done a lot of research on this, where it's diagnosable that and there's different criteria you meet to be diagnosed with major depressive disorder. It's something that's typically seasonal and something that if you take some medications to help with that, some appropriate ones, and you get therapy, that's the best combination for you to actually get out of that.
Yes.
And there's also, so that's getting into the side of the spectrum that's diagnosable. But what I'm so passionate about in giving a holistic model of what mental health is that it's the same spectrum. So the people that have these diagnoses are not that much different than the people that don't.
Oh, absolutely.
And I think that the things that they're relating to, that they're experiencing, are very severe and they're extreme, but people that maybe are fortunate enough to not pass that threshold into panic disorder, that are experiencing anxiety every day, like their experience is, I think, the concept of mental health and the framework of, why don't we give people if we give disabilities a conscientiousness in our culture?
Yes.
How do we give these people the same conscientiousness and also respect the inner person, the inner man and woman in that experience just as much as we respect the outer? And I think that's that when you get into that, it's important to me that, if you stress anybody out enough, they will have a psychotic break.
Absolutely.
That's a huge
It's the very nature of torture.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Torture is designed to create a psychotic break.
Right.
And so you can press people and press people and press people. There's a threshold.
Right.
The other thing that I think that a lot of the stigma is, and I think we mentioned it before, but I'm going to highlight it again, is the idea of it just makes you wimpy. Right? So it's like, oh, well, you have stress. I have stress. I handle mine just fine. How come you're being such a wimp? That is actually the attitude of people that are not in it.
Yeah.
Or somebody's going to go, oh, so you're depressed. Yeah, I think we all get down sometimes.
Right.
And you go, no. We're talking about severity differences.
Yeah.
What you're dealing with and what I'm dealing with are light years apart. That we're not even talking about the same thing. And so I think that in society, it's one of the reasons why you got to remember PTSD is post-traumatic stress disorder, and sometimes there's a different way to describe that, but that can happen in soldiers, and it can happen in people that work for Intel. Like, in other words, people will associate, oh, so-and-so was in Iraq, they saw something so brutal, or they engaged with such a level of stress that it began to make them have that psychotic snap. The problem is that it happens more commonly than we believe.
Yeah.
It's happening to a lot of our police officers. It's happening a lot to our fire department. It's happening a lot to first responders. It's also happening to soldiers all the time. And then what happens is, because they're labeled a wimp for trying to address it, they shove it down further, which actually causes further break.
Yep.
Yeah. And I think certainly in those professions, and even across the spectrum of life stages and professions and all of that, I think we do see that because of the stigma as you've described it. So we've talked about different reasons for the stigma. In what ways can the church work to try to remove the stigma around mental health?
Yeah.
Sonny, we'll start with you.
Yeah. I think
What's the answer?
The answer to getting rid of that thing is, let me tell you. No, I think that it's a very complex question. I think that it needs a lot of respect and attention. Is that I think you're right, Lance, that it's a lot. The panic disorder and somebody dealing with any everyday anxiety is light years apart. So, and as far as the experience and the treatment is different.
Yes.
But I think that the posture is similar in the sense that we have to have a posture of grace and understanding. And there's one, I think that one thing that stood out to me reading a lot of different materials going through school is a guy named Viktor Frankl, who wrote a book called Man's Search for Meaning. He was a psychiatrist in the Holocaust. He survived the Holocaust at Auschwitz. After all of that extreme experience he went through, one of his main principles was something about suffering, saying that suffering is like a gas, and by saying that, he meant that it only takes a little bit to fill the entire room. So it's all your perception, and after he experienced something otherworldly from what we might ever experience in our life, he pointed out that when we experience suffering, it absorbs our whole life, all of our attention. So I think that that's an example of something that helps us give a compass where, when that posture is and the response is, well, what's wrong with you? I'm keeping it together. Why don't you pull it together? I think that the fundamental posture that we need is that we have to be careful of invalidating somebody's experience.
Right.
And that's it's never a helpful response to say, you shouldn't feel that because I don't feel that, or you shouldn't feel that because you could just think this. You have to start with where they are. Yeah. And I think that's a huge shift in church for a lot of reasons. And I think that that there's so much in Jesus's heart and in the process of posturing towards people who are experiencing suffering, that it's critical that we start with compassion. We start with love, which is kindness, patience, joy, and having that mercy for the person where they're in their experience. And I think that some pieces of church culture have really worked against that, sadly, where if you're Christian and you're coming to church and you're still having problems, there's an implication that, that's probably your fault.
Yeah, you're not doing your work.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. And that's my first part of that. I'm sure there's more that might come up.
Lance, how about you?
Yeah, I think that when we read Bible stories, we forget all the mess. And I think the idea that historically church has talked about Christianity and God stuff in a very clean fashion. Well, you got to remember, Daniel was thrown in the lion's den and he made good choices. It's kind of things like that. And then you don't realize there's this intense messiness of the life of David. There's this intense messiness in the life of Job. There's this intense messiness in the life of Samson and Saul. And all of a sudden you have these mental issues and you have spiritual coming in and so first of all, appreciating mess, I think, is a critical element that I think the church is actually postured because of how Jesus has treated this and how he handles things. I think we're postured to be the number one area of help. Quite frankly, I think this is an area of strength for us because we're supposed to lead with grace, as you said. We're supposed to appreciate mess. We're supposed to understand process, right? This whole idea, which unfortunately the church has not understood very well either.
Right.
So like they'll say, when did you get saved? Tell me the exact moment.
Yeah.
Well, they ignore process
Yeah.
because they want it clean. I once was lost. Now I'm found. Let's move forward. And I once walked an aisle, so now you're saved. There's no allowance for process and mess of going, I was really into the Lord, and then all of a sudden I just walked away for 13 years, and He drew me back. You know what I'm saying? So I think telling testimony is different because a lot of times we were feeding into this.
Yeah.
Hey, tell me your testimony about how you're perfect now is really what we're asking.
Yeah.
Well, I used to have troubles. But then I got Jesus, and I don't have any troubles. So I think that the church needs to do a better job of appreciating process and messiness. I also think that the church is positioned to talk about what's really going on, to be honest, forthright, vulnerable, transparent. I think the idea that the church has the corner market on let's talk about our feelings.
Yeah.
We should be leading out on this.
Amen.
I think the counseling world has learned a ton from the church, and I think the church has learned a ton from the counseling world.
Yeah, no, that's good. I think also it's so interesting to me. I mean, I struggle with this so much as a pastor in so many different ways. You think about, for example, the pressure to conform superficially. For
Yes.
example, that gets so much emphasis, I feel like, in a lot of the Christian world, but it's not overt emphasis. Like there aren't, to my knowledge, there aren't a lot of pastors that are getting up on stage saying, all right, everybody, let's look like we have it all together.
Right.
You know?
Right.
And yet there's this pressure. You
Yes.
know, we tend to harshly judge
Yes.
particular things. You know, it's really bad to curse, and I'm not pro cursing, but it's really bad to curse, but we neglect the fact that you can just say awful things without cursing, right?
Right.
You can have hate in your heart without, so anyway, we tend to kind of
The unspoken
yeah,
culture.
the superficial gets all this attention, even though nobody's out there saying, what we need is to be a little more superficial with one another.
Right.
So,
right. But we're
And
picking up.
the superficiality is interesting too, because I think like what you're talking about and what I hear, Lance, is what I'm so passionate about is that God's heart and the heart that He has for His family is health, and it's also this vulnerability and interdependency
Yes.
with Him and with each other, and we miss that in a lot of our culture, sadly, whether it's secular or Christian. But I think that the church and the Bible and what God's Spirit is guiding us towards is setting us up to lead in that, and I love that's something that we're even talking about, because if you're connected to the mental health world at all, you've probably heard of Brene Brown. She has a podcast about vulnerability. I don't know her background as far as faith. I don't think she would profess to be Christian, but she has a lot of principles that are very aligned with the Bible. That she's a researcher, and her main point is that you do a lot of research she's a social worker doing work on societal research. You look at all the people in her sample sizes and see which ones are thriving, which ones are just living, and by all observations you can make, they have a solid family, they have solid emotional experiences, they have solid integration in their life. It's the ones that are vulnerable. It's the ones that bring their vulnerability into their relationships and make that the foundation. And it's fascinating how she gets into the research of that. But I think a huge piece of that is that in the church, vulnerability in my mind is a neutral thing. And I say that because vulnerability is how healing happens. It's how God changes and miraculously grows people. It's also how abuse and trauma happen. And I think that it's so important to have a safe culture and a safe context for vulnerability to be expressed in. And sadly, we run up against a lot of walls that we don't exactly have a safe culture to be vulnerable in.
Yeah.
And so that's kind of what we're talking about with. I'm curious from you guys from a pastoral perspective. I've been in church my whole life. I don't often hear pastors talk about something like, if you're struggling, go see a therapist. Like those words don't really come out very much. It's typically kind of more focused biblically, and I understand why. But if you guys noticed the same thing, or how that even?
It's the reason why I named my therapist in my book.
Yeah.
Because I was trying to break that normal mold. Oh, I see it all the time, and I'm going to tell you why that happens.
Yeah.
So now for some, it's because they think that psychology is hocus pocus or whatever, but that's becoming less and less of a thing.
Yeah.
I think the more modern we're becoming in understanding, I think that we're pretty well modernized. The number one reason why I think that pastors don't send to counselors is that you're sending a person in vulnerability to another person that will now have power to put into their lives, and they may not be safe. That's why they don't do it, because they're not trained up to be a pastor, and pastors don't trust non-pastors to give them spiritual advice in a weakened state. So I think it is fear on why they don't send them out. So for example, if somebody comes to me and they're like, man, I'm really, really wrestling in my marriage, I got to go see a counselor. I'm going to go, awesome. And then they go, and then at some point it comes up, are they a Christian counselor? No. Immediately I'm suspect.
Yeah,
Because
that's your natural reaction.
That's your natural reaction, because you go, I don't know what advice they're going to give them in this state, and from their core values, they may not share the same values. They may say, you know what, you're right, that marriage isn't working. Why don't you go to the next one?
Yeah.
So in the same way, I think that pastors are saying, listen, you're getting different training, and you have different values. And so I'm scared of the psychology world because I don't know what they're leading with.
Right.
They may well make things worse in one sense, even though they're helping in another sense.
Yeah, and did you have something too? I would want to speak to that too, because I agree that it's this interesting cross section or Venn diagram where it seems that the counseling world and the pastoral world intersect, and there's a natural distrust on both sides. And
oh, for sure.
And it's so sad to me because
it's legit.
It is, yeah. I think that
there's a reason to be afraid.
I think there is, but it's and speaking to the clinical side that I can get into is that if a counselor is trained well and they're following the ethical guidelines, just even if they're a secular counselor, they're obligated ethically to honor and speak into your spiritual beliefs. So, and that's not that I wouldn't recommend you seeing a Christian counselor. If you're Christian, I actually would. But I think that there is a misunderstanding along those aisles of that we are against each other. And I think that I would push for and argue that a counselor is closer to a medical doctor or closer to a physical therapist, where it's a professional that's specifically trained to help in an area of life like relationships or emotions. And it's an interesting dynamic that we're sifting through, where it's this, okay, we're kind of in the same realm, but we're against each other. And I don't know if that's always the case.
Well, we certainly are not against each other, but there is some serious danger.
Yeah.
Let's say that you have a friend who is 23. He has identified that he is homosexual, and you have two different people that he can go talk to. Do you want him to go talk to a counselor, or do you want him to talk to a pastor? Almost always, people will direct them away from the pastor.
Yeah.
Why? Because they're afraid of what's going to happen in that room. Is the pastor going to lead with the heart of Christ and professionalism, or is he going to lead into religious dogma?
Yeah.
If he lends into religious dogma, he's going to hurt someone. So most of the psychology world would go, avoid the pastor.
Yeah.
You know what I'm saying?
It's true.
Okay, well, there is legitimate fear. I'm not saying, as a pastor, I'm telling you, there's a bunch of pastors, I'd be like, I would not send anybody there.
Yeah.
Well, at the same time, there's also a fear on the other side of somebody saying, you know what, well, in psychology, we believe this. I know what the Bible says, but or this idea that I'm going to affirm you in you, and it's all about you, and this humanistic view comes across. Okay, that's a real problem. That's a real danger. So I understand that there's nervousness. What we need to do is realize we're actually on the same team. And in my opinion, just to talk to all the pastors that are listening out there, which there might be one, but to all the pastors out there, I believe that for Christian psychologists and Christian counselors, that's their pulpit. They weren't called to speak in a local church setting. They were called to minister in their unique setting, but they're just as gifted, anointed, and called. They're pastors in their world, and that is powerful. So I just want to affirm the counseling world in that and allow other people to really think through that.
Yeah,
Amen.
no, I think that's really important, and the issue of mistrust is significant. I mean, as you guys were talking, and then you just said it, Lance. There is that issue that came to my mind. Like, yeah, there's a lot of pastors. I'd be like, yeah, I don't think that's a great. And I hate that I feel that way, but
Right.
but at the same time, I think, like you said, Sonny, to think of it more like sending someone to a medical doctor. On one level, if I know that a medical doctor is a quack, then I would not. Send, but at the same time, I also, if I'm trusting licensure boards and everything else, that there's going to be a certain level of quality if I send someone to a particular place. So on some level, there probably needs to be an increase in trust all around, especially from pastors who are known for sometimes having egos and savior complexes, for us to be able to say, hey, listen, what you are needing is above my pay grade in terms of training and competency and skill set. So because I care about you and I care about what's best, I want to refer you to somebody who's just got better training in this area than I do.
Yeah,
And I think that's really important.
I do want to push. I want you to push back on what I'm about to say, because I'm going to push back on what you said.
No, I'm with you.
Like, for example, I'm going to be going in for a colonoscopy. I don't care about the guy's theological training.
Congratulations.
Thank you very much. Like, whatever. Hey, the guy is Muslim. Hey, right on. Praise the Lord.
Right.
Either way, I'm going to make sure that I don't have any polyps. You know what I'm saying? Like, I don't really care. So the idea of their spiritual background is not a factor because they're not dealing with that. So here's where I'm going to push back, because that was initially your thought of, say, think about it a little bit more like a medical doctor, that they have certain things. They're not getting into that area. However, I think they are getting into some of those areas. When you're in counseling and you're doing a lot of internal work, it is crossing over into supernatural, spiritual. It is crossing over into emotional and mental, right? I mean, so they're doing work in an area where their worldview matters as to what they will be doing. So just like I would not recommend certain pastors, I would not recommend certain counselors.
I would do this. I would do the same. I think that the sifting process is getting into just establishing a safe environment, and you need. Just like you can get a bad doctor, you can get a bad therapist. And I think that the only thing that we might be pushing against each other on a little bit, which I completely appreciate, I think, is that I think that if your only option, if you don't have the funds to pay for a private practice Christian therapist, and you have insurance that lets you go see a secular therapist, if that secular therapist is doing their job,
that's right.
You should be able to go to your pastor and talk to your pastor about what the Bible says and what you believe, and take that into the secular therapist.
Yes.
And have that therapist in the same there. I would say that just like a doctor's job, the doctor doesn't heal anything, in my opinion. The doctor just sets up the right context and the right environment for the healing to happen that God allows to happen.
Yeah, that's a good perspective. And
I would say that if a secular therapist is doing their job, then they're going to respect your spiritual perspective and interpretation and worldview, and they're going to set up the right environment for you to connect with God through that process. And that's something that I think that unless you're in the clinical world and you talk to the people about what the BBS believes and everything and everything, like, you probably don't even get to think about. But coming through and pursuing licensure and knowing a lot of licensed counselors, that very much is their defined role, is to empower the person's personal beliefs and convictions. And I don't think that that's always the best thing. So that's an interesting thing to get into as a therapist. If your personal beliefs guide you away from God, then I don't know if that's going to be a long-lasting solution. But but the counselor's job is to honor their role and honor the client's personal convictions in setting up the best garden, the best soil possible for them to grow in. And that's a little different than I think a lot of people see counseling, even secular counseling. Not that I would recommend you go see a secular therapist against a Christian therapist necessarily, but I think that there is a little more openness in my mind than we always hear.
So, Sonny, would it be fair that, and that's really interesting to me. I mean, I spoke of ignorance a moment ago. I mean, I'm just not aware of all of the different factors that psychologists have to take into account when it comes to licensure and everything else. Would it be fair to say then that a secular psychologist, their job, that there is a differentiation between mental health care and worldview formation, and we tend to maybe lump those together.
Totally.
But in mental health profession or for a mental health professional, those two things are very different.
That's traditionally and in my strong conviction, it's always been very different.
Yeah.
And that's because you're not meant to put, aside from legality, you don't put your morals on a person. You don't put your worldview on a person from a counselor's perspective.
Right.
It's very important that you don't enmesh those things, and you allow the person to go through their normal process, their internal and integral process to find those things.
Yeah. Now, here's a question that I want to raise that is not on our list of questions. So get ready. But I think this is somebody commented about this on Facebook, and it's a question that I get from time to time, and I'm sure you guys do as well. What do we do in a situation where a family member or a loved one or a close friend, whatever, where what we're observing in their life leads us to believe that might be somebody who would benefit from some mental health? I mean, we all would benefit from it, but who maybe is in particular need for it. Because it does seem like that's different than saying, hey, you've been limping for 3 weeks, you should go see a doctor. Like that's a pretty non-offensive statement. But how do we bring up those sorts of subjects with another person in a manner that it can be received? Or is that even appropriate? Is it even our place? I'd love to hear from both of you on that. We'll start with you, Sonny.
Sure. Yeah, I think that's a big part of my job, which is talking to people that might be interested in getting some support and not sure what they want or what they need, and me talking about options as far as whether it's counseling or a pastor or seeing a volunteer or a mentor, something like that. And I think that if you see a family member, you see someone you care about who's struggling, it is a very difficult thing if you can't externalize it. If you can't call it, even addiction is easier than something like basic mental health issues. You can say, oh, it's the alcohol, or you can say, it's your injury that you've
look
been
what you're using,
not
look how much you've
to.
drank. There's sort of an objective thing you can point to.
Right. But I think that once you get into the internal world of what's going on for somebody, you want to start talking about it in a way that is separate from them, because I think that there's some truth in that, in the sense that the true them is not the one that's anxious, not the one that's mired by depression. The true them is the one that God created and intended them to be. And if you can start to talk about those things a little bit separately and talk about what are some options to get some support. I think that counseling in itself has this stigma, like, why do I need to pay somebody to talk to about my problems and my things? And I would argue that I would just suggest that I think that having a safe person in a safe context is a very rare thing, especially in our culture, and that's produced the way our culture functions is that it commoditizes things. And that whether that's a good thing or a bad thing is a different discussion. But it's for a counselor to see somebody, to be a safe person for 20 to 30 people a week. They have to make a living somehow. So the priority of having somebody who is safe and objective ends up having a value. And I think that you can start to frame things that way, where friend, family member, I care about you so much, and I want you to have a place that, if you don't want to talk to me, I understand. You need a place that's not so close, maybe doesn't feel so hard. There's this other person whose job is to be safe, and his job is to work with you and to work out how can you start to have a life that's more fulfilling, a life that's different than this stuckness that we're feeling. And that's a place I would start.
Yeah. No, that's good. Lance, anything you'd add to that?
Yeah, absolutely. What I think is so beautiful about that question is I think it is the essence of our whole conversation. Here's why. I think it should be the exact same. Hey, I've noticed that you've been mentally limping for the last 3 weeks. Yeah. And the only reason it's not talked about in the same way is social dialogue. Yeah. Is that the social dialogue, there's a stigma to it. Because I think it should be entirely appropriate of going, you have been really down lately.
Yeah.
And I'm calling it out the same way I would call out your limp, and you needed a doctor in the same way that the limp needs a doctor. I don't think there's any difference at all. And I think that that's what we're trying to get to, is this is the beauty of social community. Is someone else is going to see it. They're going to call it out. So I think you should call it out. I think if you have in your home always made fun of people that go to counselors, and then you're trying to get your person to go to, you screwed it up.
Yeah.
So you better have an environment that has had a high value
Yeah.
for something like that, so that when it is time that you need to use that, right? Like there's some people that don't trust Western medicine. So you can't tell them, I think you should see a doctor. There's some people that don't like alternative medicine or Eastern medicine. You can't tell them, I want you to go see an acupuncturist. Why? Because of what is the worldview stream? What's the social stream going on? Well, there's some people that in that household, you have allowed an environment to exist where counseling is seen as a weakness.
Yeah,
You know,
right.
not only are you buying the things that Sonny just said, you're buying two other things. You're buying a trained, wise person. Okay, so you go ahead and go ask in all of your friends, who do you think is most wise, right? Okay, well, you're kind of getting one of those.
Yeah.
Awesome. The other thing that you're getting is confidentiality.
Yep.
Right.
So you're getting a privacy issue. It's one thing to have a safe environment. It's another thing to have a loving. You're flat out able to talk to somebody and they're not going to go post it on social media. You know what I'm saying? So there's a bunch of stuff that you're actually purchasing when you go to a counselor.
Yeah. There's some safety in that is hard to find in the non-legally bound to confidentiality world. Right?
Yeah, it would be inappropriate to put the weight that you can place on a counselor to put that on your spouse. And people just want to keep it in-house all the time because they think it's safer. I disagree. I think it's absolutely the opposite.
Yeah.
I think that counselors are amazing.
Yeah. And I think that it's such a hard thing. And I've been in situations where I've had to have that conversation with people like, hey, I think, counseling might be right for you. And it's an awkward conversation because you just never know how that individual is going to receive that. I mean, that they might see it as some sort of condemnation of them or whatever. And I don't think this necessarily removes the awkwardness, but I think that you can frame it in a way of, it's not that, hey, you're messed up and you need someone to fix you, but it's, I want you to thrive. I love you enough that I want you to thrive.
Yeah.
And what I'm observing is you're not thriving. And it seems to me that talking this through with a professional could give you some kind of tools in your tool belt to help you thrive. I mean, is that fair to say?
I think that's perfect.
Yeah.
I want to add a couple things to this conversation. One of the things, going back to what I think that the church should continue to teach, or actually anybody should continue to teach, is that God built us with at least 5 dimensions that we engage with. So emotional, mental, physical, spiritual, social. Okay, so somebody's going to go, well, say those again. Emotional, mental, physical, spiritual, social. God has given us gifts. God has given us tools. God has given us helps in every category. So one of the things that I'm trying to champion is let's work with the right wound with the right tool, right? Because what's happening is in the church, there's not a lot of cross-training. It's I have one tool and it should work for everything. Right? So, for example, for emotional issues, I believe the Lord offers a lot of tools in the toolbox of abiding, meaning that you're spending time getting your heart ministered to, that you're actually dealing with a lot of pouring out, getting stuff off your chest. I think that God uses certain things for that. For mental, it's identity. For a lot of mental issues, it's remaking. You are a child of God. It's that kind of stuff. For physical, there's a lot of talk about health. You can go, well, I should just pray more. No, you need to diet and exercise, quite frankly, because it is a fact. And then the spiritual, you have issues like prayer. That's a tool that we use for spiritual issues. For social issues, the issue is community. God gave us community. So when we keep trying to use one tool and say it's good for all of it, you're downplaying what God built you for and what he's equipped you with. And so to tell somebody you need to go to counseling, it's saying use the right tools and gifts that God gave you to handle the right area. That's it. I don't
really
think there should
smart.
be any stigma about that.
Yeah, no. That's
The
good.
other piece that I'll share is that a big problem in the church is that we are reading things on the surface of the Bible and assuming we know what he meant. So, for example, Jesus said, do not fear. As a matter of fact, if you want to go back into a study of all the times God says, do not fear, it's everywhere. And then Jesus uses this phrase, don't be anxious. So people assume he's talking about anxiety. He is not. He is talking about worry. And so worry is actually a different category than anxiety. So fear would be if I jumped out and went, boo, and you went, okay, stop reacting. You know what I mean? Like, that doesn't make any sense. Fear is actually a necessary response to keep you healthy.
Right.
Oh my gosh, if I walk in that fire, I'm going to get burned. That fear is supposed to keep you healthy.
Yeah.
So God wasn't saying shut off your fear. God was not telling you don't, hey, control your chemical level. That's not what he's saying. What he was saying is, if you allow your mind to go into bad patterns, I need you to line it up with reality.
Yeah.
And what God speaks to is reality, not perception. So he'll say things like, there's no reason to fear. What he means is in reality, there's no reason to fear.
Yeah.
But that's not your reality.
Yep.
Your perception's creating your reality.
Yeah.
Go ahead.
And
You were
I
gonna say something.
I resonate with this so much just because I think that I've tracked along similar lines where there's this difference in when we hear fear.
Yes.
We hear that we got to stop feeling anything negative. And if that was true, then Jesus is not a good example. And
That's a great point.
I think that
Beautiful point.
I think that's where we have to find our compass. That's what we have to be drawn towards, is what did Jesus do? What did he do with those emotions? He felt them intensely.
Yes.
He sweat blood.
Yes.
Like I would say that he had fear and even apprehension, severe negativity about having to die and go to the cross. But what he did with it was so profound, is that he submitted it rather than worrying about it. He took it to God and he submitted it to faith. He said, Lord, your will, not mine.
Yes.
Rather than how can I control it?
Yeah.
But he was handling all of his social dimensions well. It says, and he got in the boat and fell asleep.
Yep.
Notice he didn't pray more for energy. He actually just rested.
Yeah.
You're like, guys, and then it says he withdrew and isolated. Yeah. Why? Because he socially needed isolation time. Yeah. The other piece I want to say is it's not just in the fear and anxiety. It's on the depression side as well.
Definitely.
Because it says, Jesus said, I want your joy to be full. And people go, well, if your joy's supposed to be full, you shouldn't be depressed. And you go, you missed it again.
Right.
That's not what he's talking about. He's not talking about chemical levels. He was talking about the idea of, oh, I don't have enough. Oh, I don't have enough. And he's like, hold on, you have a ton. I've given you everything you need for life and godliness. Yeah. That tank should be full. We're not talking about that. And so people go, I shouldn't be depressed. So anyway, I just wanted to make it practical.
That's good. So we're running out of time, but I have two more issues I want to hit on before we close. First is, so according to the National Alliance on Mental Illness, 1 in 4 Americans suffer from some sort of mental illness any given year. So that's a lot.
It should be 4 and 4.
Yeah. Well, so here's my, and something you alluded to a moment ago, referring to Jesus and taking a nap and everything else. So if 1 in 4 have some sort of diagnosed or treated mental illness, I think 4 in 4 of us have a little bit of anxiety or a little bit of depression or some nervousness, just different things. So I want to talk for a second about self-care. And Sonny, you as a therapist and being in that world, what role does self-care? We're not talking medication here. We're talking lifestyle rhythms and practices. What role does self-care have to play in mental health?
Oh, it's a huge role. I think that's the foundation for anybody, no matter what part of the spectrum you're on. We're talking about whether it's an extreme, you're past the threshold where maybe there's enough brokenness in the physical makeup of our body that unless God heals it, we need some medication. You still need to have a foundation of self-care, and that goes all the way down to somebody that is blessed with something that a relatively within normal bounds of functioning neurochemical makeup, you will degrade very quickly if you don't have self-care. And I think that the concept of self-care has to be along the same lines of our concept of mental health. Is that we're going to integrate and we're going to acknowledge every part of our life with a spirit of grace and a spirit of love towards ourselves and towards the other people in our life. So I think that if you don't have that perspective and you don't have the concept of, okay, I think that the one Bible verse that speaks to this very profoundly is the way Jesus summed up the law. And he said that you need to love your God and you need to love others as you love yourself. It's always very interesting to me that he chose as the word there to inextricably link those things.
Yeah.
That and it implies, I think, two things in my mind, that you can't love others if you're not loving yourself,
Mm-hmm.
and that if you're loving others, you need to love yourself. So it goes both directions. And I think that Jesus falling asleep on the boat is such an example of that there's times that he walked away from the crowds, and then the crowds followed him, and he didn't get stuck in this conflict of, oh, I'm frustrated you followed me, now I'm just going to do something anyway just to be a good person. He felt in that moment the emotion come up of compassion. It says he felt compassion on them, and he said, okay, I'm going to give you what I have. Yeah. And then there's other times he walked into the desert and there's no one that was going to follow him. There's other times he went into the boat and he just fell asleep because that's what he needed to do. And I think that those are so, it's so profound to keep those things tied together, that we have to start with ourselves in order to love other people, and we love ourselves the way God loves us.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, no, that's good. I mean, ultimately, I've been thinking a lot about self-care lately in my own life, is you cannot be the best version of yourself for others if you're not caring for yourself.
Totally.
Right? You can work 70 hours a week because you are just, you want to be about others and serve and all that stuff. But you know what? You're going to die on the vine, and those are not going to be 70 quality hours for very long, right?
Yeah,
you're not going to be the best husband or spouse. You're not going to be the best parent if you're not taking stock of, okay, what do I need? In all those different categories you mentioned, Lance, what do I need to do to keep some measure of health in these different areas? So I think that's just an important part of self-awareness, is recognizing, what do I need diet-wise? What do I need in terms of sleep? What do I need in terms of rest that is actually rejuvenating, as opposed to just time not spent working?
Yeah.
And just to be conscious of that and not feel like it's selfish. Because laziness is selfish, but self-care is not. Because self-care
it's wisdom. And the thing is, and on all those dimensions, those 5 dimensions, they're interwoven.
Yep.
So, for example, I went to a concert the other night, and it ended up, I did not get to sleep till 1:40 in the morning. I'm a 46-year-old man.
Congratulations.
What the world am I doing? So my point is, that was a couple days ago. I'm still affected by it. So it's going to affect, I'm in a funk today. Like I don't feel right today. Why? Because we're integrated.
Yep.
All that stuff affects something else. Yep. So if I can take a flyer once in a while on that.
Yeah.
But if I was not, but for self-care, you have to bring it back in. Why? Because it's going to affect every other dimension in your life.
So you're saying a concert 7 nights a week where you're up till 1:40 would not be a good thing?
It's a horrific idea.
That's a very
Even
bad
if you're
idea.
a teenager.
Okay, last question, and we could do a whole episode, I think, on just this question, but instead we're going to try to cover it with you two answering it very briefly. And that's simply this. What can the church do to help those who are suffering from significant mental health challenges? How can we create welcome? How can we create space? How can we just be a loving presence in the midst of mental health challenges that are difficult not only for the person suffering, but can be difficult for others as well? What do we do with that?
Yeah, with severe challenges specifically, I think that the most important thing is what we do in our own hearts. Is the way I would put that, is that we don't dehumanize them. I think that and if we can address that, there's so much that flows from that, and it becomes so much easier in how we view and how we respond to somebody who's struggling significantly with a mental illness.
Yeah.
And I think that there's all kinds of ways to help with that. And one begins with just acknowledging that they're not that different from us. We are a few steps away from having a mental breakdown, like we talked about. Like you put the right circumstances around us, we will start seeing things. We will lose contact with reality. And I think that has a lot to do with our humanity and the broken world. So if somebody is in such a state that they're mentally ill and they can't even have a regular conversation with somebody, for example, I think a response of humane compassion is appropriate. It's where that this is a child of God whose body and physical experience is so broken that their spirit doesn't even get expressed all the time. But there is opportunity in that would blow us away. The more you connect with people who are mentally ill, that you can see who they are and who God sees them as.
Yeah. No, that's good. Lance, how about you?
Yeah, I mean, it's going to be the simple answer of we got to love on them, and that's going to practically look like you got to listen. I think the first thing we need to do is listen, because there's stuff that's going on, and some of it may not be mental health in a heavy way. It could be something of, I just need affirmation, and it can heal my heart. I think that we need to be, we need to encourage people to talk about their stuff. And not have a, oh my gosh, what did you just say? You know, that kind of thing.
Yeah.
Let's have some good responses. And the other thing is we need to pray with them. And we need to pray with them not just for the power of prayer, but pray with them because in prayer, they'll tend to begin to talk about it. Like there's an appropriate space for them to talk about what they're really going through. So it is an opening to having a deeper dialogue. So that would be my thoughts.
Yeah, great. I have thoughts I'd like to share too, but for the sake of time, we're just going to leave it with the brilliance from the two of you and not have me bring it down a level here with my my random ideas. But Sonny, thank you for joining us today. Thanks for sharing your wisdom.
Thank
Super
you,
good
man.
stuff.
I appreciate it.
Thank you, Lance, as
pleasure.
well. Thank you to those of you who listen. And if you feel like counseling is something that would benefit you, we do have our Soul Care professional counseling ministry here at Bridgeway. If you go to www.bridgeway.church and then click the Care and Compassion tab at the top, you can find information about Soul Care and how you can get connected there. Otherwise, there are all sorts of other counselors you can look at, but certainly we are pro-counseling here at Bridgeway and would encourage you to look into that if that's something you would benefit from. Thank you to those of you who listened. We sure appreciate it. We'll see you in 2 weeks. Thank you to Lucian on the audio, Brenton on video, Jeff in Montana who are in here fixing stuff before we got here. You guys do the hard work. We do the easy stuff. Thanks, guys. Appreciate you. All right, we'll see you in 2 weeks for the next episode of Engaging Culture. Bye-bye.
Thank you for listening to Engaging Culture, a podcast by Bridgeway Christian Church. If you enjoyed the show, please consider subscribing and leaving a review on iTunes. Thank you so much for listening. Music is used under the Creative Commons license and is provided by Dexter Britton.